You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 31st of March 2021 on Monocle 24. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist coming to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
It's now 425 days since I declared COVID-19 a global health emergency. In that time, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought out the best and worst in humanity.
The World Health Organization releases its report on the coronavirus pandemic. We'll ask, now that we're piecing together what happened, how can we prepare for the future? In Russia, the Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny faces solitary confinement. What will that mean for him personally and for the opposition in the country? Plus, 5 years in the making, Iran and China have finally signed a deal, just as the US is attempting to renegotiate with Tehran. We'll get expert analysis on what this means. Then...
If employees in one side of the company get vaccinated in Serbia, as this company works in Serbia, the same opportunity should be given to their colleagues that work in Macedonia, who are Macedonian citizens, for example.
We'll hear stories from the front line of the vaccine rollout in Serbia. And Ever Given, the mega container ship that blocked the Suez Canal for several days, has finally come unstuck. But has the global economy done similar? We'll examine the implications for global trade from one glitch and ask what lies ahead. With a look through the front pages and a quick business hit, we'll end with our countdown to Eurovision and the delights that Iceland has in store for us. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. Let's begin with a quick look at what is happening in the news. The heads of Brazil's Army, Navy and Air Force have all resigned as President Jair Bolsonaro struggles to contain a crisis over his leadership. Germany is suspending routine use of the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine for people aged below 60 due to a risk of rare blood clots. The pharmaceutical company says the benefits significantly outweigh the risks. And Airlines for America, a group representing major US airlines, has committed to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Do stay tuned to Monocle 24 throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, more than a year after the coronavirus pandemic first swept the globe, the World Health Organization report into the virus has finally been released. Although it doesn't give a definite origin for the disease, the WHO says it's likely that it was transmitted from a bat to humans via an unidentified intermediate animal species. Virologist and Monocle 24's health and science correspondent, Dr. Chris Smith, joins me to discuss this now. Chris, thanks for coming on. Firstly, why was this report so long in coming?
I think there are a number of reasons, but one of them was that the Chinese were not terribly supportive. If you recall, just a few months back, the investigators were held up getting visas, getting into China. They were just stuck in Singapore for ages. And then once they got there, it was very much a staged, managed thing. And this has not happened for the first time. It's happened many times before. There have been a number of obstacles put in the way, which meant that was difficult for a start. And just doing this kind of work is really tricky. You're saying, where is the smoking gun that caused a pandemic in a city that has millions of people living in it, in a country with 1 billion plus people living in it, and it's a big country. So to try and track all these different moving parts down and pin them down on one mechanism is really, really tough, which is why this report has a number of different possible reasons to account for what they think might have gone on, but it has also taken a very long time.
And the WHO chief himself has expressed dissatisfaction with it, hasn't he?
Well, it doesn't really do anything other than tell us what we knew already. If you look back to news reports about a year ago of what we were talking about here on this programme, on other bits of Monocle output and in the media more broadly, people were saying, well, there are a number of possibilities. One possibility is that this could have escaped from a laboratory. There is an international centre for coronavirus research right in the middle of Wuhan. They have been working on strains of coronavirus a bit similar. That's one possibility. There are also obviously track records with with viruses like this jumping out of animals and into humans. That's a possibility. There's also the example of SARS Mark 1, which happened in 2002 to 2003. That was a bat coronavirus that jumped in a market into another species, in that case a civet cat, and then got into people. So all these scenarios were mapped out over a year ago, with people saying these are the possibilities. What this report doesn't really crystallise is, well, which of them is the most likely? And there's also a bit of appeasement going on, because they've even kept this was imported on frozen food into China argument that the Chinese are very fond of, because of course it kind of argues that China isn't responsible, and they desperately want it not to be the source, but all the evidence points to the fact that it did emerge in China.
I mean, and the report offered a little bit more detail on the wet market, where the disease is, in some people's eyes, has thought to have begun.
Well, certainly there was a catalyst there, in the sense that that's where a lot of the attention focused in the Wuhan wet market to start with. And that's not surprising, because there was a lot of footfall, lot of mixing of people. There was obviously a source there, because there were cases stemming from it, but that is not believed to be the origin of this. The origin of this is probably a bat somewhere, and that bat then gets the infection into some kind of intermediate species, and we don't know what, but pangolins have been sort of fingered at one point as the possible cause. We just don't know. And then from there into people. But the evidence we have is that there was very wide diversity of coronavirus already circulating in Wuhan by the time that the WHO were notified at the beginning of 2020. And to get that level of diversity, it's clear that it was already circulating quite broadly across the city for quite some time. So the market is probably one source, but it's not the only source, and it's not the sole origin.
Are there any recommendations in the report as to how to stop further pandemics which might be transmitted in a similar way?
Regrettably, a lot of the recommendations are things that we knew already, and which we've been saying for years, but we can repeat them here, which are that it's absolutely critical to be transparent with information. Knowing what we're dealing with and how these things occur is very, very important. If it is a jump between wildlife and humans, which it looks like it is, then how do we mitigate that? Well, that comes down to good stewardship of the land, making sure that we don't over-urbanise, overdevelop and overpopulate, especially remote areas where it brings people into contact and conflict with wild animals. And then the whole question about, well, when these sorts of jumps do happen, because they do, and they happen from time to time, how do we make sure that we are on top of where they're going, what's causing them, how they're transmitting, and have a mechanism in place for stopping this sort of thing at source much more quickly? It's obvious that had China acted more quickly than they did, we may have been able to hold this thing back, and it wouldn't have turned into the catastrophe that it has.
Now, we know that the virus is mutating. Can the current vaccines control it, or are there new ones being manufactured that may be able to do so?
Well, all viruses mutate and change, and so this one, it's not surprising, is no exception. And the evidence we have so far is that some of the variants of the virus that have emerged have changed in a way that means they are harder for the immune system that has responded to the original, let's call it classic strain of coronavirus, to suppress. Doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means you need higher levels of antibodies in order to achieve that degree of protection. But not everyone's going to make that level of antibody, and not everyone's going to keep that level of antibody. So there is a threat and a risk that some of these variants will be able to bypass the protection conferred by antibodies made in response to vaccination. But what can we do about that? Well, we can revaccinate people, and that's what Nadhim Zahawi, the vaccines minister in the UK, has outlined for the autumn in Britain, where people will be revaccinated, particularly those top 4 priority groups, as they're known, the people at highest risk. The idea being to top them up, to push their antibody levels to the highest possible. We're also very fortunate because the technologies that we have now to make these vaccines are much more what's being dubbed agile than previous vaccine technology, meaning it's relatively easy to update them. But that ignores the fact that there are 8 billion people on Earth, and you potentially have to keep revaccinating everybody. So it's not trivial. Actually, making updated vaccines is the easy bit. It's getting them into people at the sort of scale we'd have to that's the more tricky one.
In the news today, we were reporting about this risk from the AstraZeneca vaccine that it may cause blood clots in particularly younger women. Is that serious?
Well, the kind of blood clot that they're talking about are the so-called cerebral venous sinus thrombosis events. There are some specialist large blood vessels inside the head called venous sinuses, and that's how the brain drains its blood flow. And very rarely they do form thromboses or clots in those structures. The thing that's got people spooked is that in people who are having these vaccines, there appears to be a higher level of those than would otherwise be expected. And so some countries, as a cautionary measure, are temporarily suspending the vaccine use in lower age individuals. And this is a risk assessment because we know that the people who are at risk of this happening appear to be younger, but the people who are most at risk from coronavirus and therefore have the most to gain from the vaccine are older. So in some places they are setting an age threshold cutoff to say, well, people under 55, we won't use this while we investigate, but people over 55, the risk appears to be very low, and your risk from coronavirus is much higher. So therefore the risk assessment is that you carry on having the vaccine. If you're older, don't have it if you're younger. Some countries have said, well, we won't use it at all until we have ironed this out. But let me just underline this. The number of these cases is tiny in comparison to the fact that there have been millions of doses of vaccine administered, and your risk from coronavirus remains high, and your risk from long COVID type symptoms if you catch coronavirus also is very high, potentially 1 person in 3. So at the moment the current safe approach is to get vaccinated, which is why most countries are continuing regardless, but some are being more cautious.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. That was Monocle 24's health and science correspondent, Dr. Chris Smith there. Alexei Navalny, the prominent Kremlin critic, was arrested in mid-January on his return to Russia from Germany, where he'd spent months recovering from a near-fatal nerve agent poisoning in August that he blamed on the Kremlin. In social media posts from Pokrov Penal Colony No. 2 east of Moscow, where he's serving a 2.5-year sentence, Navalny says he's facing the prospect of torture and repeated spells in solitary confinement for infringing prison rules. Well, Natalia Vasileva, who is the Moscow correspondent for The Telegraph, is on the line from the city now. Natalia, thanks for joining us. What is Navalny's current situation?
Good morning. Yes, you're absolutely right. He luckily does get visited by his lawyers. So we get information now and again. We still don't have a full update on his health since he has been examined by a prison doctor, but he's told his lawyers that he hasn't been given any medical documents or any diagnosis at this point. He has complained about severe back pain, and he said that he often loses sensation in one of his legs. Again, if you look back to his nerve agent poisoning in summer, this could all be very concerning, but the picture at this point is very unclear.
What are the consequences of being sent to solitary confinement, both for his health but also his mental well-being?
Well, yes, as you've pointed out, you think you've mentioned the name of the colony. It's about 100 kilometers east of Moscow. It has been described as one of the worst Russian prisons by both rights advocates and former inmates. They do have special cells called punishment cells, which are essentially cells for solitary confinement, which means that you're staying in enclosed space at long stretches of time. You're not allowed any walks or any communications with anyone. And people who have gone through solitary confinement have obviously complained about severe psychological damage. And also, if you talk about the Russian opposition movement as such, isolating him in prison, especially in solitary confinement, would mean that the opposition would lose him entirely. And as someone who can, urge people to take to the streets or who can, send an inspirational message, something like that.
Although he is still sending inspirational messages, how is he able to post on social media?
Well, I don't think he's physically posting himself. What happens is that he still gets visits by his lawyers, and I think he passes on messages or he dictates it, something like that, yes.
Do you think that this is helpful to his cause? Will there be increased pressure on the Russian government from the international community if his treatment continues to be publicised, or does it risk a backlash?
Yeah, we saw that Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, and Vladimir Putin had a phone call last night to discuss the vaccination drive, to discuss possible EU purchases of the Russian vaccine, and they did raise the issue of Alexei Navalny. It's hard to say whether this pressure can work at this point because, as you know, this is year 8 of Western sanctions against Russia. And at this point, these sanctions that have been imposed in relation to the Navalny case have produced very little effect on the ground.
So what further action could be taken?
Well, in terms of the EU, Navalny's allies have advocated for sanctions, for pinpointed sanctions against people whom they describe as Putin's inner circle oligarchs. People like Roman Abramovich and Alisher Usmanov, who are billionaire businessmen, also with very strong footholds in the West. So at this point, from what I'm hearing, the likelihood that these people can be faced with visa bans and even asset freezes don't look terribly great at this point. So
what about Navalny's anti-corruption foundation colleagues? Are they also being penalised?
Well, the government here has actually been very clever in neutralizing some of his key allies. 2 or 3 his closest allies are currently abroad, so they are able to work normally. But 2 of his closest allies in Moscow have been placed under house arrest, which on the one hand doesn't elicit as much protest as you would expect if someone is sent to jail. On the other hand, they're not able to canvass, they're not able to use the internet and communicate with others. But yes, his anti-corruption foundation at this point is a rather large organization with staffers not only in Moscow but also in the regions. So they have been able to put out investigations, I would say on regional scale, not something as bombshell quality as Navalny's investigation about Putin's alleged palace. But yeah, it looks like they're trying to soldier on and see what they can do without him.
Natalia, finally, I mean, when he was first arrested, we saw huge protests across Russia. I wonder how much the Russian people know of the situation that he's in now and if those protests are likely to continue.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. We had a kind of an outburst of very angry, very massive protests nationwide for 3 weeks in a row. Again, this was happening in January, February, and as you imagine, we have a very cold winter, so the conditions were not entirely conducive to staying on the street long stretches of the time. I would say that we should be expecting more protests, but not immediately, but more closer to the parliamentary elections in September, possibly summertime, when some of Navalny's allies are actually hoping to run for seats in parliament. So this is the time when we're going to be seeing some Kremlin reactions to those bids. We're going to see if the Kremlin would be allowing those people to run. So that is the time when we should be expecting more protests, I would say.
Natalia, thanks very much indeed. That is Natalia Vasilyeva in Moscow there. Now, still to come in the programme, we speak with Daddy Freuer about Iceland's Eurovision entry.
We landed in second place, which was like a turning point for my career. That meant that all of a sudden people in Iceland knew who I was and I could be a professional musician. And then, we went back last year and won the Icelandic competition. And that didn't happen, so here we are.
This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries. over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
China and Iran have signed a security and economic cooperation agreement, which will be valid for 25 years. This deal comes as the US plans to resume talks with Tehran on a proposal to reduce economic sanctions in return for Iran's agreements to stop some of its nuclear activities. Well, Holly Dagraz is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and editor of Iran Source blog and joins me now. Holly, good morning to you. Let's start with this deal, which has been under negotiation for 5 years. Now, there are two major strands, economic and security. Let's address the economic side first. Do we know what this will mean for Iran?
Well, I think for starters, when we say it's been negotiated for 5 years, it's technically was proposed by China's President Xi Jinping to Iran in 2016. And it's only been in this past year, since last July, have we really seen these two countries actually start having the real talk about signing this 25-year accord. Now, what this accord entails is that both security and economic partnerships. And this includes things like installing a 5G network, improving infrastructure in the country like railways and oil facilities. But it also has this security component as well, which is, among things, security or intelligence gathering. And so what the agreement entails is that basically, China would invest up to $400 billion in Iran in exchange for cheap oil. And that's the thing that's really irking some people, some Iranians inside and outside the country, is that this is actually a deal that may make Iran a client state, or as some have called it, a form of neocolonialism or debt trap diplomacy. Now, it's really hard to say that that's really the case here, because this is actually something that China has actually been doing with countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So Iran is not alone on this whole thing.
There's a proposal, it would seem, to set up an Iranian-Chinese bank, which would give Tehran a financial foothold outside of the Western-dominated banking system. Does this mean that various targeted sanctions can then be avoided? And what does that then mean about China being part of the nuclear deal, which, of course, says that should not happen?
Well, the possibility of a Chinese and Iranian banking relationship is very much there. But at the end of the day, if the United States wanted to take steps, it could sanction China on this front. But it seems that we're not at that point yet, as such a banking has not been pushed forward. But you do raise a valid point. China is one of the world powers that is a signatory to the Iran nuclear agreement, the same agreement that the Trump administration withdrew from in May 2018 and reimposed punitive sanctions on Iran. Now, under the Trump administration, an oil embargo was imposed on Iran. And I think this is where the important details are. Despite this oil embargo on Iran, China has been quietly or secretly purchasing Iranian oil. And it has been doing so in ways where it mixes Iranian crude with other oil, or in some instances, Iran or China has been disguising oil tankers that have been going to China. And so what's been happening is that despite these punitive sanctions, Iran has been able to get its oil over there, and the Trump administration hadn't done much about it. Now we have the new Joe Biden administration in office, and they are essentially not doing anything that we know of so far. And part of it is because they do want this nuclear agreement to survive. They want Iran to return to strict compliance because, as you know, Joe Biden was part of the Barack Obama administration who negotiated the deal. So they're hoping for this deal to survive. And this is where things are right now, I would say.
And how has Iran reacted to the fact that Biden wants to start talking?
Well, the latest we're hearing is from Politico is that they're going to be proposing a new idea to Iran, which is basically if you return to strict compliance in some areas, like reducing to 20% enriched uranium, we're going to give you some sanctions relief. That's the latest rumor. But I think BBC's Jeremy Bowen has kind of given the best example of what's happening here. It's like these two countries are having a staring contest, and they're seeing which one's going to blink first. But with this new China proposal, it seems that Iran is now gaining some more leverage in this situation.
And of course, there are presidential elections in Iran in June. I mean, does that place further time constraints on Washington?
Yes, it does. And I know that some critics are skeptical about the impact of the Iranian elections because at the end of the day, the last decision is made by the supreme leader. But I do believe that the Iranian elections play an important factor. We've had a moderate government in Iran for the past 8 years, and they were the ones that helped negotiate a nuclear deal. And there's this assumption that a hardliner will likely take power, and somebody with possibly an IRGC background. And hardliners are known for being vehemently against the Iran nuclear accord and have been also pushing to look east, as this 25-year strategic agreement shows.
Holly, thank you very much indeed. That's Holly Dagres there. Here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. The heads of Brazil's Army, Navy and Air Force have all resigned as President Jair Bolsonaro struggles to contain a crisis over his leadership. Earlier this week, Bolsonaro was forced to reshuffle his cabinet after his foreign and defence ministers both quit. His popularity has plummeted over his response to COVID-19. Brazil now has more than 12.5 million confirmed coronavirus cases. Germany is suspending routine use of the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine for people aged below 60 due to a risk of rare blood clots. Canada has already suspended the use of the jab in people under 55. AstraZeneca said international regulators had found the benefits of its jab outweighed risks significantly. And Airlines for America, a group representing major US airlines, has committed to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The trade group said it intends to work towards a rapid expansion of the production of sustainable aviation fuel, and that it's been in contact with the Biden administration's climate change officials to discuss expanding the sustainable aviation fuel market. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. As Europe's complete kerfuffle over coronavirus vaccinations continues, some EU leaders have been accusing certain third countries of vaccine hoarding. But that's not a charge anyone could level at Serbia. Over the past week, it's vaccinated tens of thousands of people from neighbouring countries, with the rush to take advantage of the offer causing tailbacks at border crossings. So why has Serbia turned into the vaccine fairy of the Western Balkans? Monocle's Guy Delaunay has been at Belgrade's main vaccination centre and can tell us about it. Guy, good morning to you. How did this vaccine bonanza come about?
Morning, Georgina. Well, it was originally the wheeze of the Serbian Chamber of Commerce, would you believe? And they asked the government if they could make vaccinations available to business people from across the region, because there's a sort of regional organisation of chambers of commerce in the Western Balkans, and the idea took off from there. It was a reasonable request because Serbia had already arranged the vaccination of the North Macedonian Journalists Association, and they'd also been vaccinating medical professionals from parts of Bosnia as well. So the Chamber of Commerce invited around 10,000 people from countries like Bosnia, North Macedonia, and even countries with which Serbia has had somewhat tricky relations, which is to say Albania and Kosovo. And Marko Mandic told me all about this. He's the organiser from the Serbian Chamber of Commerce.
This helps companies in Serbia, and this helps companies from the region. And these companies are connected. You also have big systems which have a company from Serbia has companies in Bosnia, Macedonia, a company from Macedonia has companies in Serbia. In a sense, we try to provide on a company base, if employees in one side of the company get vaccinated in Serbia as this company works in Serbia, the same opportunity should be given to their colleagues that work in Macedonia who are Macedonian citizens, for example. So we looked at this from a very practical perspective, that this is good for our economy and it is good for the economy of our neighbours.
But Guy, it wasn't just business people who turned up.
No, it really wasn't. And if you look at the pictures which have been going around, you can see that many, many thousands of people turned up once word got out the vaccines were on offer in Serbia. Because if you're in Bosnia or Kosovo, you've been very frustrated if you've been trying to get vaccines because they simply haven't arrived. Kosovo just got its first shipment from COVAX on Monday, for example. And Bosnia, it's always chaos getting anything at all in Bosnia. So this idea that Serbia's got them, you can just drive over the border, you don't need a PCR test, enormously tempting idea. And people were turning up at vaccination centres with nothing more than optimism. But the authorities decided to jab the lot of them, around 22,000 over the weekend alone.
But bearing in mind that lots of places are suffering from a shortage of vaccines, how on earth could Serbia afford such largesse?
It's because its vaccine procurement programme has been almost too successful, if you like. It's got a smorgasbord of options. You can actually choose which one you prefer. So you've Russia's Sputnik V, China's Sinopharm, and the US-German Pfizer jab. But Serbia, because of this, actually found itself with a surplus of AstraZeneca vaccine, which was about to expire. And Prime Minister Ana Brnabić actually said it was better to jab foreigners than throw the vaccine away.
And have there been any negative reactions, to Serbia's generosity rather than the jab itself?
Well, the odd sore arm, of course, but some doctors have been pointing out that while Serbia may have jabbed more than a third of its people in double quick time, so that's more than any other country in continental Europe, vaccine scepticism in the country means it may struggle to reach the numbers required for herd immunity, and perhaps it might be better off concentrating on some much-needed internal PR. Dragana Jovanovic is a professor of pulmonology at Belgrade University Hospital.
As for this anti-vax population, I am afraid it is quite a big percentage of people. I think it is nearly half. That might explain, at least in part, what's happening now, that people are not going to be vaccinated, although they have the choice, although they can easily be vaccinated. Many doctors and many, well-known persons recognized in public, they speak against vaccine. So what is left then for a normal citizen or a villager that just goes and look at the TV and says what's going on? There is no consistent policy and no consistent approach to this problem.
So, Guy, are the jabs still on offer for all?
Well, the offer has expired along with a batch of AstraZeneca vaccine, it would seem. But, of course, anybody who got their first jab will be offered a second jab to complete their course in the coming weeks.
And Guy, just finally, have you had the vaccination?
I couldn't possibly comment, Georgina. That's between me and my personal physician.
Guy Delaunay there. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me in our Zurich studio at Dufferstrasse 90 is Emily Isaahu, a programme organiser, a coordinator at ETH Mediation in Peace Processes. Emily, thanks so much for coming in this morning. And in fact, you are physically in our studio, which is a wonderful thing to at least be able to visualise. Can we start with the Guardian newspaper? And this is looking at new wealth taxes and a minimum wage in New Zealand.
That's right. Good morning, Georgina, from a beautifully sunny Zurich. So indeed, the Guardian reports on legislation that will take effect in New Zealand starting tomorrow, so 1st of April. So the government of New Zealand, led by Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, is raising the country's minimum wage and the top tax rate for those with the highest incomes in the country. So the minimum wage will be raised to 20 New Zealand dollars per hour, which will affect approximately around 175,000 workers in the country. And anyone earning over $180,000 a year in the country will then have their tax rate raised to 39%, which will again affect more or less around 2% of the entire population in the country. And the Prime Minister Ardern, as she announced these policies, pointed to these as being real and long overdue improvements to the support we provide to our most vulnerable in the country. And she pointed to the continued need to build more homes in the country, improve the country's healthcare system, invest in education, create job opportunities. And this is in a context of a comparatively high child poverty rates in New Zealand and extremely high housing costs. So for instance, Auckland has one of the most unaffordable housing markets in the world. And then actually just earlier this week, it was reported that the wait list for public housing in the city had hit an all-time new record. But of course, this piece of legislation has been met with some opposition, particularly the National Party has been opposed to this, calling it economic vandalism during a very difficult time of the pandemic. And they've also pointed to the fact that New Zealand already has one of the highest minimum wages in the world.
Well, talking about economic vandalism and really just bringing your country down, let's go to Brazil, where there's shocking news. Bolsonaro's had to shuffle his cabinet, but also the heads of all his militaries resigned.
That's right. It's been a busy week for Bolsonaro, for better or worse. So the Financial Times reports on the cabinet shuffles in Brazil. So, of course, a country that is currently reporting more new coronavirus cases than any other country in the world. And Bolsonaro has fired, or there have been a few resignations in his cabinet. So starting on Monday, Foreign Minister Ernesto Araújo was replaced by Carlos Alberto Franca, and thereafter the Defense Minister Azevedo e Silva resigned in opposition to Bolsonaro's policies on both health, with regard to the corona pandemic, but also the role of military therein. And the day after, the head of the army, as well as the head of the Navy and the Air Force resigned as well. And this is the first time in Brazil's long history that leaders of all three branches of the military have resigned out of disagreement with the president. So this is, of course, a worrying trend, and the article points to Bolsonaro's increasing effort to put people supportive of him in various positions, particularly in the military, in the run-up to next year's presidential elections.
I mean, can he survive this? What does the FT say?
Well, the FT does not take a strong stance on this, but they make the point that this is really tiptoeing, so it could go either way. So, of course, he still has a broad constituency and support in the country, but at the same time, if all three heads of the different branches of the army or military have resigned, this is a worrying side, I think, also for Bolsonaro in terms of his popularity in the long term.
Now, there's chaos too in the parliament in Slovakia.
That's right. So yesterday, Slovakia's Prime Minister Igor Matovic resigned, and he was replaced by Eduard Heger, who was the finance minister coming from Prime Minister Matovic's own party, the Ordinary People Party. And the incoming Prime Minister is described as a low-key politician with a background in economics. And Prime Minister Igor Matovic was forced to resign as a result of a crisis within his one-year-old ruling coalition. So he had reportedly, without explicit agreement of his coalition partners, ordered 2 million doses of Russia's Sputnik corona vaccine, which had not, of course, been approved by EU's medicine regulator at the time. The article continues to point out that it's too early to tell whether this reshuffle that was accepted by the president will calm tensions within the ruling coalition party, because the biggest tensions, in fact, are between the Ordinary People Party and the Pro-Business Freedom and Solidarity Party, and this was not addressed through this reshuffle.
Let's go to Ireland now, and there's a whole new strategy there called Our Rural Future, which is trying to use the pandemic really as an opportunity to rejuvenate the countryside. How are they doing that?
That's right. So this is reportedly the first rural strategy coming out during or in the middle of the pandemic. So the Irish government just published it, as you called it. It's titled Our Rural Future. And they're hoping to do a couple of things to rejuvenate Ireland's countryside. So one, they want to build a network of 400 remote working hubs and offer tax breaks both for individuals as well as companies supporting home working. And they are hoping also that 20% of the country's more or less 300,000 civil servants would work remotely by the end of the year. And then this they could, of course, do from rural areas as well, and not just from the cities. And they're, of course, also investing in broadband rollout, so you have good connections throughout the country. And they're emphasizing people rather than buildings this time around. So in the early 2000s, there was a previous decentralization effort by the government, which led to many government buildings being removed from Dublin. But this time their focus is again on people rather than buildings. But businesses in Dublin, in the cities, are of course concerned with this. They've been hit heavily by the pandemic. And also some analysts and professors and researchers interviewed in the article point to the fact that they're beyond work. There are other reasons why people choose to live in cities. And they probably will continue to want to live in cities because of their cultural offerings, restaurant offerings, and so on and so forth, even if they were able to work from home.
Let's now look ahead to the UK, which is going to host the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow in November. But certainly Finland is one country that's wondering if really that's the right thing to be happening.
That's right. So there's an interesting piece in Helsingin Sanomat, so the main newspaper coming out of Finland, or the biggest newspaper, and they look ahead to the climate change conference, as you said, meant to be hosted by the UK in partnership with Italy in Glasgow this upcoming November. And the article is assessing whether the UK remains a credible host for these discussions, because Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government has announced major cuts to its development aid budget. So moving from 0.7% to 0.5% of the GDP in being invested in or directed to development aid. So this is, of course, a very negative signal, or perhaps a wrong signal to be sent by a host country that during the conference is meant to attract funding for climate measures from countries around the world. So this has, of course, been a controversial policy within the Tory party, of course, criticized by the Labour Party as well. But at the same time, the article is not all doom and gloom. They do point out the fact that the UK does have a net zero emission target by 2050. And in fact, last year, partially due to the pandemic, emissions were cut down by 13% in the UK. But let's see how this continues. But from the optic side, Helsingin Sanomat sees this as a bit ironic.
Emily, thank you very much indeed. That was Emily Aisa-Aho joining us from our Zurich studio. And this is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
The mega container ship Ever Given has been freed from the Suez Canal, where it had blocked the waterway and a great deal of global trade for several days. And although the ship itself has sailed on, Can the global economy recover as swiftly, and what lessons have we learned from this? Well, to discuss the implications, I'm joined by the economist and author Vicky Price. Vicky, good to have you on the show again. This is not the first time that the worldwide financial system has been exposed to a shock emanating from one country, is it?
No, and of course we've had the problems with the financial crisis when, of course, in the US, where it all sort of started, if you like. Of course, there was lax regulation everywhere, but it all started with the mortgage-backed securities there, which went horribly wrong. It then spilled over to everybody else. And we had, of course, the recession and then the problems that took us quite some time to get over. We only just got over them, of course, and we got the pandemic. But the type of development that has taken place since is, of course, that the move to globalization, if anything, accelerated. And the just-in-time production, reducing costs to consumers who, of course, could ill afford to pay an awful lot more, given that per capita GDP was cut in so many countries and still hadn't recovered in a number of them, including in some European countries, to pre-financial crisis levels by the time the pandemic hit. All those things, of course, have encouraged producers to ensure that they were getting inputs from the best and cheapest places across the world. And world trade, if anything, became an even bigger part of GDP than was the case before. So everything is very interconnected. So if something happens at the Suez Canal, then it obviously affects consumers everywhere, because the supply of materials, goods, oil, everything else you can possibly think of, and inputs into the manufacturing process get halted for a while. I mean, the good thing is that it didn't last terribly long, but we just saw what that interconnectivity in fact means.
So how can we better insure ourselves against events like this?
Well, lots of people are talking about the end of globalization, perhaps, that we should onshore and produce more at home and reduce some of those lines that we depend on in terms of where things are coming from. But of course, we all know full well that one of the reasons why the system is developed as it is because it is much more efficient that way. Container ships have been developed, which are, of course, as we've seen with this particular boat, can be quite enormous, but of course they cut the cost very significantly, and they have been incredibly successful because loads of smaller firms can bring things in by putting things in one container as part of a much, much bigger shipment that exists right now. So it does help hugely, not just the big firms, but also the small firms. But the idea of bringing everything in and then moving back to quite unproductive production, which was what was the case before, and even before we can think of, the benefits that trade has brought to everybody, will, of course, increase costs at the end of the day. And yes, it might improve security of supply, but it's not going to be good for the world economy as a whole.
So what happens when or if the EU imposes a carbon adjustment tax on imports produced in countries that have few restrictions on carbon emissions in their production processes?
Well, I did say that, of course, globalization was a good thing. But what we have seen is, first of all, increased protectionism that has taken place, both on goods, when you see what's been going on under President Trump. Of course, that's changing only a little bit now with President Biden. But we've also got, of course, quite a lot of non-tariff barriers that have gone up all across the world. So we're not talking about free movement of goods and services anyway. But of course, the whole climate change issue has been a very important one that everyone is looking at. And yes, we're all trying to reduce carbon emissions. But of course, offshoring production, which leads to that trade increasing and benefiting quite a lot of countries, means that we're also exporting quite a lot of our carbon emissions. So if we just reduce carbon emissions at home, but we allow them to grow somewhere else, then obviously that's bad news for climate change and what it might mean at the end of the day. So the idea has been for quite some time that there should be a carbon adjustment border tax, which actually punishes whatever comes in with an extra tax, carbon tax, if they are produced in places which don't really have any serious emission control. That, of course, will affect trade, and it will affect quite a lot of developing countries. And it will need to be discussed, I think, a lot more, because if it becomes part of the general trading system, there could be, of course, complaints to the World Trade Organization by other countries. But if it does become that, then yes, okay, it might encourage some better production, fewer emissions in the future, but it will actually disadvantage quite a lot of developing countries, and quite substantially.
So, finally, just to wrap up, Vicky, has the ever given us a completely different future for global trade?
Not necessarily. It's quite interesting also in terms of the costs involved, because I've been hearing Lloyd's of London saying that they thought that the maritime claims may only be in the hundreds of millions, when we were, of course, hearing that something like sort of 9 to 10 billion worth of goods were being held up every day, and that's going to be a serious cost. So perhaps not fundamentally, but I think people will rethink whether the way that we're doing things is the best, whether we should be using more air freight, whether any diversion of traffic should be through routes that are not so dependent on a relatively narrow gap between countries. But I think that world trade will continue unabated, in my view.
Vicky, thanks very much indeed. That's Vicky Price there. And this is The Globalist on Monocle 24. Now, the 65th edition of the Eurovision Song Contest will take place on the 22nd of May in Rotterdam, and fans are very happy to hear that the Icelandic entry from last year, Daddy og Gagna Magnith, will compete again with a new track, 10 Years. The cool electro-pop act made headlines last year with the song Think About Things, and perhaps could bring the trophy to Iceland for the very first time. Monocle's Eurovision correspondent Fernanda Augusta Pacheco spoke to Daddy Freyr about Eurovision, Icelandic electro-pop and more.
Baby, I can't wait to know. Believe me, I'll always be there. So
in 2017 or in 2016, I wrote a song and sent it into the Icelandic competition for 2017. And it was never the plan to actually compete myself. It was just like I wanted to try to send in a song and see if it would be accepted, and then I was going to get somebody else to sing it. In the end, that didn't work out, so I decided to do it myself. And then I got the group together, like my wife, my sister, and 3 other friends, because you can be 6 people on stage. So we created this group, Daddy og Gagna Magnith, around Eurovision. And we landed in 2nd place, which was like a turning point for my career. That meant that all of a sudden, people in Iceland knew who I was and I could be a professional musician. And then, we went back last year and won the Icelandic competition. And that didn't happen, so here we are.
Here you are again. And again, was there a lot of pressure, to follow up Think About Things? Because it was a massive hit. I mean, people really, really loved it. It was a great song. Was there kind of a lot of pressure? Oh my God, what I'm going to do next to have the same impact? Because I have to say, I did listen to 10 Years and is amazing. It's really good. And I think you did a good job. But did you feel that pressure, or was it very natural, the process of creating 10 Years?
I think it was the same pressure as I felt when I did Think About Things. It's more people listening, but it still feels like kind of the same risk. I didn't feel like it had to become as popular. That's something that I don't really have any control over. So I just wrote a song that I wanted to take to Eurovision, that I could feel good about competing with, that would fit Daddy og Gagna Magnith, because we have, this is our 3rd song now, or the 3rd song that I write for this fictional band. I didn't write it in one sitting. It took some attempts, but I didn't feel too much pressure.
What is it actually about, the 10 Years thing? What does it represent?
It's me and my wife. We've been together for 10 years.
So you have a very close connection with your family, because Think About Things, is it true that it's about your daughter?
Yeah.
Daddy, tell me a bit more, because, Iceland did quite well at Eurovision, a couple of years. What's the relationship between the country and Eurovision? Because, I know some countries have kind of a slightly mockery vibes, like here in the UK. In Sweden, they take super seriously. What's the relationship between Iceland and Eurovision?
I'd say it's going more in the direction of Sweden. It was more uncool a few years ago. At least that's my experience. Maybe it's just because I'm in the middle of it now. That's why I'm experiencing it that way. I don't know. But I think it's changing a lot, and it's super popular here. Like, everybody watches Eurovision. Even if you don't like Eurovision, you have to sit alone. You have to lock yourself out somehow to not watch it, because everybody is watching it. On the Saturday, especially when the finals are happening, there are Eurovision parties in basically every household.
I have a question for you. Of course, I really love the sound of both Think About Things in 10 years as well. It's quite lovely electropop. Was that, clearly you had some sort of music career before all those songs came out. Is it that your style, kind of just good, very good electropop in a way?
Yeah, it's not too far from what I make usually. The sound, and that is what I do, but it's more the structure of the song, how it's like to fit into those 3 minutes that the Eurovision, that's the rules of Eurovision. It can't be longer than 3 minutes. And it also has to work as a performance. So I'm thinking about the performance as I'm structuring the song.
And what's the plan now? I know with COVID it's quite difficult to say, but do you plan to go to Rotterdam? Do you think this year things will be happening?
That's the plan, yeah. But we have already recorded backup performance in Iceland. So everybody has to do that. That's competing now. If we're unable to actually go to Rotterdam, we can still have a performance. But I'm still positive that we will get to go out. But it's going to be different from what Eurovision is usually, because we're not going to get to have too much contact, I think, with the other contestants. And there's going to be a lot of distancing and stuff like that. So yeah, it's going to be a different Eurovision than everybody else has experienced.
And finally, I must ask, because I think a lot of people spoke about it, those jumpers you wear, I think the songs, they're lovely. Where are they from?
I can't remember what the company was that we got them from the first time. The reason for the pixelated faces, at least, is in Eurovision, you can't play real instruments, or you can't plug them in and it's all on playback, the backing track. So we wanted to have fun with that. So we made fake computer instruments. And from that, we decided to have the pixelated faces on the front and have this nerdy aesthetic. And then the color, just because nobody else is using this color, so we wanted to own it.
How does it keep getting better? Every day I'll find somewhere to go. The time we spend together simply feels good. We got a good thing going.
And that was Daddy Freya speaking to Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco. And that's all we have time for on today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Carlotta Rebello, Daniel Bate and Paige Reynolds. Our researcher was Charlie Filmer-Court and our studio manager, Maylee Evans, with editing assistance from Steph Chungu. After the headlines, I'll be hosting the Continental Shift with more great music and sharp programming until we join Tom Edwards for The Briefing, live at midday London time. And just to throw ahead to a programme that you might want to listen to, Meet the Writers. Our guest this week is Michaela Wrong. Now, she is a journalist who's reported extensively throughout Africa. Her latest book is called Do Not Disturb, and it's all about Rwanda. And it's fascinating in that it really changes the post-genocide narrative of what we all thought happened there. Really well worth a listen from our archive. Now, The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.
Monocle and UBS are proud to present A Nobel Cause, a book that celebrates more than half a century of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. A Nobel Cause gives an overview of the 84 winning laureates and their influence on global society. It builds excitement around economics by talking to the laureates and unpacking their theories, from a pioneer in the field of the economics of climate change to an Israeli psychologist who changed the way we think about thinking. The winners' stories make for an incredibly diverse read. As well as real-life case studies of applications of the prize-winning theories, you'll find an illustrated history of global economics. Alongside a look ahead at what we can expect over the next 50 years, you can discover the story of Alfred Nobel himself and the legacy of his awards. On sale from October 2020 from Monocle and UBS. Purchase the book from our retail stores or from monocle.com. A Nobel Cause, asking the questions that shape our world.